Good day, and thank you so much for joining us for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg take a dive into the minds and experiences of daily life here in the 18th century. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and we're going to take you behind the scenes at a virtual open house here at the Colonial Williamsburg Costume Design Center. My name is Brandon Lyles, and today I am joined here by first-hand tailor Lori Ramsey. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Brandon.
Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do here at the Costume Design Center?
All right. As Brandon said, I am Lori Ramsey. I am one of the first-hand tailors here at the Costume Design Center at Colonial Williamsburg. As a first-hand tailor, I get to help make, maintain, and alter the costumes that are used in our historic area. So if you come visit Colonial Williamsburg, you'll see people in costume. I get to help make that magic happen. I can also fit interpreters in their costumes, either because they're new and need to have their costume for the first time, or something's worn out or just doesn't fit.
Excellent. And we are looking forward to hearing from you out there watching this program. Please send your questions to us through that little comment section. But to get us started, I do have some questions for you, Lori. First off, how do you decide what to make or how something should look?
Well, we have a number of different sources we like to use, Brandon. Ideally, we would love to have an original garment from the 18th century and a portrait of somebody wearing that garment, maybe an account book saying where they bought it or a letter describing where they wore it. Generally, that just doesn't happen, unfortunately. But we can still learn lots of things from original 18th century garments, both in Colonial Williamsburg's collections and also other museums' collections. We can also look at portraits from the time period or engravings. There's also various written sources we can look to, whether it's someone's diaries or letters. Maybe they're describing what they wore to a special occasion. Or the newspaper's a great place to look. If you look in the Virginia Gazette, merchants are advertising what sorts of things they're selling in their stores. Or another great source of costume information is runaway ads. When an enslaved person or an apprentice ran away, the master would often place an ad in the paper, and often they would describe what that person was wearing when they ran away.
Those are all great resources, great places to turn to for information. Has the process for research and designing and making clothing changed over time?
Yes, it has. As in many fields, the resources available to us have improved over time. We've had access to more things, and we're always learning new things about costume. And attitudes about costuming have changed over time as well. We first started costuming in the historic area in October of 1934. Back in the 1930s, we kind of wanted to give you a taste of what the 18th century looked like, kind of an 18th century flavor over a modern silhouette. Today we're more focused on making a more authentic picture. So structural garments, for example, we dress women in stays, which is the garment that shapes the body to the fashionable cone shape in the time period, as opposed to modern undergarments, as you might see in older photographs of costume interpreters here.
What is your favorite garment that you've worked on?
My favorite garment that I've worked on. It's very hard to pick a favorite. My favorite thing to make is stays, but I love making costumes in general. Blanket coats are one of our newer things that we've added to the historic area. So if you see some of our American Indian interpreters wearing our blanket coats, they're actually cut from old blankets. And that was a really fun thing to make, I think. Lots of hand finishing and things like that. Very relaxing to work on.
And what about this piece here?
This one or?
This one.
This one. This is the 80th Light Infantry. This is the latest military uniform that we've come up with, and that was just in the past couple of years. So you might see our military program staff wearing this uniform. I actually have made one of well, one of the coats. It's a lot of work with all the lace, but the end result is quite pleasing, I think.
It's a stunning piece. Don't forget out there, please post any questions that you have, and we'll be happy to take those here. We do have a question here from Chris, and Chris asks, is this your dream job?
Yes, it is, Chris. Thank you for asking. Yep. Love historical costume, love history, and Williamsburg was where I wanted to wind up after college, and here I am.
That's fantastic. Now, do you use any modern technology when you are making this clothing?
Yes, we do, Brandon. A lot of our costumes are made using modern technology. You've only got about a dozen people or so sewing the costumes, and over 600 people in costumes. So you really do have to use modern technology to make that happen. And modern technology goes through all sorts of different steps in the costuming process. We have a computerized CAD system for patterning. So if something upstairs, we don't have anything that fits you, we can actually make a custom pattern just for you using a computer system. As far as constructing the clothes, we have sewing machines in here. We have both domestic and industrial machines, just depending on what the particular tailor's preference is. We also have a machine that does chain stitch hems. We have some wonderful industrial sergers. I love those machines. And we've got a machine that just does buttonholes. All you do is set how long you want it to be and press a pedal and away it goes.
How long would it take to make a costume for, let's say, a male?
For male, now, generally, if we're costuming you, we're not necessarily making everything new. A lot of times, we're going to fit you from stock. And if I have things that fit you, I might be able to get you an outfit in a few hours. As far as how long it takes to make an individual piece, let me think. A shirt, that's several hours. A waistcoat, that's several hours. Breeches might take a day. A coat might take a day. And if I'm making things for you, a lot of times things don't necessarily get finished. We might start on a pair of breeches. So this is a pair of breeches. But we might not put the knee bands on until we've had a chance to try them on you, so we can figure out exactly which length to make them. So that can add time to it. But if we do have stock that fits you, we can easily get you dressed in just a few hours.
We do have a question here from Jeannie, who asks, how has the material changed from the 1700s to today?
As far as the fabrics, we tend to, just like the 18th century, use natural materials. With printed cottons, they're printed using modern techniques. In the 18th century, it was much more laborious. So if you were doing a printed cotton, it's block printed. So there would be different wooden blocks with areas carved out for each color. And what the printer would do is they would apply a mordant. So the material that makes the dye stick to the fabric, they would apply different mordants to the fabric for each color and stamp them one at a time on the fabric, and then they would dye it, and so the dye would come out different colors. In the time period, a printed cotton cost almost as much as silk, just because it was so labor intensive. And if you look at period cotton fabrics, they might actually look a little sloppy compared to modern things, especially the blue, because there was no way to print the blue on. You had to apply it by hand with a paintbrush, so you might get little drips and things. So the printed cottons, we will often do reproduction prints. So some of the printed cottons you'll see in the historic area are actually based off of originals in our collection. But as far as what they're made out of, in the 18th century, they're using linen, cotton, silk, and wool, and that's what we're trying to use here as well. There's a glazing process that they did on cottons in the 18th century that we haven't been able to replicate. But in general, if you see somebody in costume in our historic area, they're wearing natural fibers, just like they would have in the 1700s.
Excellent. And we do have a question here from Tina, who asks, Does the Costume Design Center ever make costumes for other historic venues?
Generally, no. We just focus on in-house use.
And Anna from Ohio, age 11, asks, I have Felicity costumes that I wear at home and when I visit Williamsburg. Do you make stays for my age and do you sell them?
Well, in the 1700s, you would have probably been wearing stays, and while we do actually have some child-sized stays here, we don't sell those items, unfortunately. But thank you so much for your interest. Felicity is how I got here.
Caitlin asks, what did you study before you went into this line of work? And any tips for an aspiring costumer?
My degree is actually a little bit unusual in the building. I have a bachelor's in public history from Western Michigan University. So my degree focuses on presenting history in a public as opposed to classroom setting. And I just sew as a hobby. Sewed as a hobby before I came here. I taught myself how to sew, making clothes for my Felicity doll. Um, if you're interested in being a costumer, the main thing, at least if you want to work here, is you need to know how to sew. To get this job, I had to pass a skills test. And it was a pretty rigorous skills test and took about 4 hours.
Wow. What was the hardest part about the skills test?
The hardest part, honestly, was the part where I psyched myself up ahead of time, thinking that it was going to be even harder than it was. I had to, I've actually held 2 different jobs at the Costume Design Center. I was hired as a tailor and then was hired as a first-hand tailor when a position came open, and I had to do skills tests for both. I think that the hardest part was probably just walking in and, showing that, yes, I can fit a costume on somebody. Mostly because I thought I was going to have to match a lot of stripes and things.
That's wonderful. That's a skill I do not possess. So, Anne asks, why do you believe some pieces survived? Because they were an unusual size and couldn't be reworked into an updated piece for someone else?
That's a very good thought. Things have survived for different reasons, and we might not necessarily know why something has survived up until now. Something might have been saved because it was made for a special occasion. Think about wedding dresses even today. That's something that gets set aside and saved, or, sometimes it's cut up into something else, but that item is also usually special and saved. Maybe it was something that didn't fit well and couldn't be reworked or reused in some way. And a lot of original pieces that do survive have been reworked over the years. For example, there are things in Colonial Williamsburg's collections that were reworked for what's called fancy dress in the 19th and 20th centuries, where it was made to fit over structural garments from those time periods. So some of it's honestly just luck if something survives. And sometimes it's just a mystery. Why do we have this? Maybe the person didn't like the fabric. We don't really know.
This one is one that we get out on the streets as interpreters quite a bit. This is from Tina, who asks, does the Costume Design Center do the cleaning for the costumes?
We are happy to clean interpreters' costumes for them. The way it works is the interpreter will drop off their costumes at our laundry counter, and we will send them off to one of our vendors. They do both laundering, so washing in water, as well as dry cleaning, and we'll send them to the cleaners based on what's appropriate for that fabric. And then some delicate things we wash by hand here. The only things that interpreters are expected to wash at home on their own are their shirts, their shifts, and their stockings. So basically their colonial undergarments. So shirts, the shift is this garment here. It's just what's worn next to the skin, and of course, stockings.
Very good. Holland asks, where does the Costume Design Center get their fabrics?
I'm not entirely sure where our fabrics come from. We actually have a buyer who sources those materials for us.
These are great questions. Keep your questions coming in. We have one here from Dean, who asks, how about the fabrics that they were originally made with? Are you able to recreate them? Mostly cotton and wool, I'd guess.
Yes, and actually some of the prints that you might see in the historic area are actually prints from garments we have in our collections. The most recent one I can think of off the top of my head is a couple of years ago we had a gown in our collection from the 1780s. It was a brown print cotton, glazed cotton. That was the cotton we couldn't quite replicate the glazing on. The gown was interesting because it wasn't finished in the time period, and it was a kind of a featured garment for the Costume Society of America that year. But we actually have a copy of the print. So we copied the print on the fabric. That was done digitally in some way.
We have a question here from Franco and Donna, who both ask, can any costumes be purchased from the Costume Design Center?
No, the Costume Design Center doesn't really sell costumes. We are kept pretty busy just keeping our costume staff in the historic area dressed.
And that's a lot of people to costume as well.
Yep, yeah. Like I said, over 600. And a lot of those people have more than one job. So they might have even more costumes. So
any idea of how many pieces of costume are out there amongst the staff?
We looked it up this morning. It's almost 60,000 items of clothing. Wow. And we actually have a computer system that keeps track of all of those pieces of clothing. For example, so you drop your clothes off to be cleaned. How do we keep track of where that's at? We actually have a barcode inside all of the costumes. So we can scan it. And so we'll be able to look you up in the computer. Is your costume at the cleaners? Which cleaner did we send it to? Is it back in the building? Do you have it in your possession? Computers can be very helpful.
That's a lot of tracking. Doug asks, who determines what an interpreter will wear? Can they come to you with a costume idea?
In general, when somebody's new at Colonial Williamsburg, they have a set, what we call allotment, for their job. So it's a printed sheet that I'll get when I take them up for their fitting, and it'll list the different costume pieces that are necessary for that person's job. And it does vary based on what they're doing. So if somebody's, say, cooking in one of our 18th century kitchens, we're not going to give them clothes that can't get dirty. Or if they're giving tours of the governor's palace, we're not going to necessarily have them up there in the same thing that they would be cooking in. So I'll look at what that person is doing and see what we have in stock that fits that. Now, if somebody has a specific request, there is a procedure for them to go through to get that. If they have a special need, we try to accommodate that. So things like maybe they've had surgery and they need something that's easy to get into, or maternity wear is something that we'll do to accommodate a pregnancy, that kind of thing. Also, if an interpreter wishes to wear their own costuming, they do have to go through an approval process before those are worn on the street.
And Linda asks, is the dress that is shown next to you, actually, a design from colonial times?
Yes, this is an 18th century style. I can't remember off the top of my head which collection it's from. I want to say it might be Tasha Tudor. But yes, this is actually based off of an 18th century original. And this particular dress, as I said, was made for Mamie Gummer to wear when she was portraying Lady Dunmore. And it's got a fun little polonaise detail at the back as well. So this is based off of an 18th century design.
Very nice, very elegant as well. Anne asks, do you allow tours during the time the staff are making the clothes?
In general, we're only open to the public for our annual open house. Every now and then we might have private tours come in that I believe is arranged through group sales, but I'm not 100% sure.
Very good. Olivia asks, is it hard to find detail elements for costumes?
I know that some things have taken a while to source, but especially with the internet, there are definitely suppliers out there to find things. The buttons for our 80th Light Infantry were custom made, and the tape, the lace tape, was also something that we were able to source. It took a while, but we were able to get it.
Uh, Steve asks, are any styles uniquely from the colonies versus England?
There's nothing specific I can think of that's uniquely from the colonies versus England. I think people were adapting some to the climate, but we are an English colony. Most of our materials are coming from England. As a British colony, we are actually a market for British manufactured goods. So everything coming into Williamsburg had to come through England first. So might something have been locally adapted? Maybe, but it's not something that I'm positive about. The only thing that I can say would definitely be, just here in the colonies, would be what our American Indians wear. But that's more of an adaptation of trade materials.
We do have a question here from Camilla, who asks, do you incorporate modern fastenings on certain costumes, like zippers for ease of wear for interpreters?
Generally, no. Women's costumes fasten with hooks and eyes. So this one has hooks and loops, or laces or ties, just as they would have in the 18th century. So the shift has a drawstring neck and sleeves. The petticoat, which is what we call the skirt, it ties. It actually makes the costumes more adjustable that way. In the time period, it was helpful to accommodate a pregnancy because you could just lace something a little looser. Men's costumes, you get a whole lot of buttons. So, I tried to do the math in my head earlier. A man's coat has about 29 buttons on it usually, the waistcoat 11, and the breeches about 12. So that's a lot of buttons, plus the 4 on the shirt. So a man's outfit has a lot of buttons. In the past, costuming-wise, we did incorporate some convenient fastenings. If you look at our Instagram post, there's a great picture of a dress from the 60s where there's this hidden separating zipper right up the center front that's very, cleverly flapped over. But today, buttons for men, women, hooks, ties, and some things just fasten with straight pins.
Very good. Beverly asks, how many costumes does each interpreter have? And do they dress themselves at home or come to work in dress?
Okay, so an interpreter, it depends on what you do. Your average allotment if you're working full-time, has about 60 pieces. And you keep your wardrobe at home. And in the morning, you look at where you're assigned to work and dress yourself accordingly. And then it's your responsibility to make sure you come in and turn your costumes into us regularly for cleaning.
Very important.
Yes.
Casey asks, before sewing machines, I am guessing every single stitch to putting together the clothes was by hand. How long would it take to complete the red jacket behind you?
By hand? I'm not sure. I've never tried doing one by hand. It depends on what kind of stitch you're working by hand and how experienced you are with hand sewing. If you've been hand sewing for a long time, you might be surprised how quickly you can actually sew by hand. If you've got that muscle memory and you've been doing it since you were a child. So, I can hand sew a hem on a petticoat in maybe an hour, less if I'm rushed. Somebody who's less experienced might take them longer. But as far as this garment, probably a week.
I've just noticed another very important question that we often hear.
Okay.
Are the clothes very warm for the interpreters to wear during the summer?
That is a question that interpreters themselves often get asked. if it's 90 degrees out and very humid, it doesn't matter what you're wearing, you're gonna be hot. What I can say for the costumes on a hot day is think about how people who live in the desert are dressed. They're usually covered, they're usually in layers. And the fabrics that we're using for our costumes are natural fibers. So on a hot day, if you're wearing linen, it's really not that bad. If you're a woman in costume, you've got that shift on as your lower layer. The shift actually helps wick away your perspiration and keeps you feeling cool and keeps you looking fresher on the outside. The other thing that helps with the costumes is, especially, if you're a woman, if you're wearing a kerchief over your shoulders, if you're wearing mitts over your arms, you are covered. You're not out there cooking in the sun. So, does it get hot in Virginia in the summer? Yes. Is it hot in the costumes? Yes. However, if somebody was sitting out there wearing synthetic clothes or with a whole lot of skin in direct sunlight, they probably would actually be hotter than our interpreters.
Well, let's look at that too from another perspective. This time of year, it is very cool out on a day like today. What would be the best fabric for an interpreter to wear on a day like today?
On a day like today, wool. Wool is a wonderful insulator. Even if it's a wet, nasty day, wool will insulate you if it is soaking wet. So wool is just an amazing, amazing natural fiber. If you've never worn something wool on a cold day, try it. It's awesome.
We do have a question here from Janet, who asks, what is the difference in fit between 18th century and modern structural garments?
Well, a good comparison, honestly, is if you stand me next to Lady Dunmore here, if you look at how I'm shaped like I'm wearing modern structural garments because, I'm a modern person. Lady Dunmore here is kind of cone-shaped. You can see how her torso is very smooth because she's wearing her stays. I can show you what a set of stays looks like. This is one of the styles of stays that we use. It's got steel boning in it. 18th century it would have been baleen. That's not something that's very nice to use anymore, or I don't think it's legal. Difficult to acquire. And then this laces up the back. And so that's what's giving Lady Dunmore her kind of cone-shaped here. So that's kind of a difference between 18th century and modern garments. So I'm kind of natural shaped, and she's cone-shaped.
Very good. Susie asks, do the interpreters have to buy their costumes, or are they provided?
We provide the costumes for the interpreter while they work here. If it wears out, we'll replace it. And at the end of the employee's time here, we do ask them to turn them back in so that they can go to somebody else.
We also have a very relevant question here from Shirley Ann, who asks, what is your favorite costume you've made to date?
My favorite costume that I've made to date? I think my very, very favorite piece, it's not something that's actually out in the historic area. I mentioned the brown gown that was we copied the fabric for, and that was kind of a central feature for the Costume Society of America meeting a few years ago. I got to help hand sew a copy of that. I think that's one of my favorite things I've done because it was something very unique and special. But other things that I've done that I'm really fond of, honestly, the blanket coat, that's really cool. They are, I think, one of my favorite, newest 18th century pieces we've got. But I think all the costumes I've worked on, and I've really been lucky to get to do some pretty neat stuff.
And we recently had a blog post about this particular coat, which I believe we'll link to as well. Rhonda asks, have you incorporated masks into interpreters' wardrobes?
Yes. A bunch of us made a lot of masks actually. Our interpreters who are in costume are required to wear masks. So yes, they're wearing masks. This is basically the kind of mask that they're wearing. We used cotton fabrics from here, and we also donated some to a local hospital.
Very nice. Meredith asks, or I'm interested to know a little about the buttons. What metals were used? What insignias were used, etc.?
Well, in the 18th century, buttons kind of run the gamut. You can have metal buttons. So we've got our military coats with the metal buttons. Those are plain. These have the 80th logo on them. You could get very fancy buttons with paste, so, pretend gemstones, foil. I believe there's a blog post or a video about death's head buttons. Those are a wooden core that's wrapped with thread. Those are pretty neat. Little Dorset buttons. They're little metal rings with linen thread wrapped around them. I think there's actually Dorset buttons on this shirt here. I don't know if you can see that. So we have buttons that are made of bone with mother of pearl on them. It just depends on who you are and what the buttons are doing. We're not going to put fancy rhinestone buttons on your trousers that you're going to, wear while you're coopering or something. But, say you're getting dressed up for one of our dance programs. A lot of those suits have beautiful rhinestone buttons on them that actually get taken off and put back on every time we clean it.
Wow, that's a lot of work too. Caitlin asks, since modern dress forms are shaped so differently than 18th century silhouettes, do you have special dress forms for women or tricks to make them work?
Well, the trick with this particular one, it's actually a foam dress form, so it's squishy, and I actually laced a pair of stays onto this dress form. But yes, modern dress forms can actually be a little bit problematic because in the 18th century, clothing hung on the body differently. If you get things that are actually based off of actual period garments, these women have been wearing stays since they could walk. So their posture is different. Their shoulders are very far back and the backs are very narrow. So it can be very difficult to get them onto the dress form.
Tim asks, in theater, costume designers often create designs that reflect authenticity and artistic impulses. How do these two aspects balance in an environment such as Williamsburg, which is attempting to recreate accurate history? Does ease of use also play a big part?
I think some of it's just based on what materials are available, but we do try to create a more authentic picture. Now we do produce some theatrical costumes, so we do have some kind of wild stuff on one of the back racks. But in general, if you're going to see somebody wearing it in the historic area, we're trying to create as accurate a picture as possible of what somebody would actually have done in the 18th century. Now, a lot of the gowns, we sewed hooks on the front to fasten them instead of every single one being pinned. But there are some employees who prefer to have pins to fasten their gowns, so we accommodate that. And doing things the 18th century way doesn't necessarily make it harder, and in some ways, it's convenient. Like I mentioned about the waistbands on your petticoat, you can adjust it. So, our bodies can change over time. But I just, tie my petticoat tighter or looser, or pin my jacket further over. So we don't really need to make a lot of accommodations for modern things. The exception to that is, if somebody has some sort of medical thing, we do provide employees with orthopedic shoes if they need that, for example. Or, sometimes somebody might have an injury where we might have to cover a cast or something like that. So we kind of have to work around that. But in general, it's as authentic as we can make it. Now we don't have a time machine, so I can't go back in time and see exactly how somebody's wearing their clothes, but we do our best to create as authentic a picture as possible.
Mary asks, do you allow costume designers access for their research for stage, TV, or movies?
Um, Now, the person to speak to about that would be our manager. But in general, I think we've rented out costumes for some productions, but I've never dealt with that kind of thing myself. I fit, but our manager would know more about that.
Alyssa asks, do you have a specific costume that comes to mind as being the most useful in your collection for telling a specific story?
For telling a specific story, what I can say is every single garment we have here has a story to tell. When you're an interpreter and you come to get your costumes, you get to sign your name on a card. And every single card tells that garment's history, who's had it and when they had it. So every single one of these has a story to tell. As far as a specific garment telling an individual story, livery might tell a story. If you don't know what livery is, if you were a servant to someone in the 18th century, you might be dressed in their livery. And to us as modern people, a lot of that livery looks really snazzy, honestly. With some of it has lace, some of the color combinations are really fun. Peyton Randolph's is red and green. Our Dunmore livery is blue and brown with some silver braid. So it looks really exciting to us as modern people, and to an 18th century person that would tell a completely different story. That tells you that that person is someone's servant, or in Williamsburg, that person is that person's property. So that does tell a very powerful story, and it kind of shows that there's different interpretations from how modern people see things and how an 18th century person will see it.
Jeannie asks, what is that dark coat behind the print dress?
The dark coat is a great coat. So on a cold winter day, something like this is great to keep our male interpreters warm.
They are wonderful. Nancy asks, why did women not have many buttons?
A lot of it's adjustability. There are some women's garments that do have buttons. Riding habits. If you're, a woman and you're riding a horse, you're traveling, you might wear a riding habit, and those were based on masculine dress, so those did have buttons. But the idea is adjustability. It's not something that we think about as modern people because clothing is more disposable to us. In the 1770s, I'm a married woman. I'm probably going to have a bunch of kids. So my clothes need to adapt to pregnancies, to changes in body shape over time. So if I can lace something or tie something or pin something, it's much more adjustable than if I'm pinning it or than if I'm buttoning it.
We have several viewers who ask if they can purchase patterns for costuming.
We do not sell patterns for costuming here. I'm sorry.
Steve asks, do interpreters in the millinery shop in the historic area also work in the clothing department? And do you take turns working in the historic area?
So the millinery and the tailors in the historic area are separate. They will do some special pieces for maybe nation builders, maybe other tradespeople, something like that. Sometimes something that's made there might come here to be barcoded. But in general, we're two separate things. What the tailors and milliner mantua makers are focusing on is researching historic clothing and the techniques that are used for them. Our job is more to costume the entire historic area. There is occasionally some collaboration. A couple of years ago, they did a gown in the day project at the millinery, and some of us got to go over there and be extra stitchers for that, so they could get some things done. So I got to hem a ruffle for that. But in general, we are separate.
And we have a question here from Paige, who asks, for clothing that needs repairs, are some pieces repaired using obvious repairs like they would have done in the 18th century, or do you just replace the item?
We will do repairs. So it depends on what the garment is, but in the 18th century, clothing is an investment. It's not disposable. So it's not like today where you can, get a hole in a t-shirt and discard it and buy another one. Clothing is an investment. So in the time period, you would, darn holes or patch holes or fix frayed hems. And we do that. We'll do some fairly extensive repairs. Now, if a repair is just going to, make an interpreter uncomfortable, we're not going to put it on there. So we don't, put patches in awkward places. But in the time period, people would have worn repaired clothing. So you are likely to see interpreters in the historic area wearing clothing with patches or darns on it.
Sherilyn asks, did women ever wear pants?
I know that there's some cases where women disguise themselves as men to join the army during the American Revolution. I can't think off the top of my head if there's anything specific where women were wearing trousers, but that just wasn't really how women. Oh, actually, there is one I can think of, although it's not here in Virginia. Supposedly, Marie Antoinette wore breeches, according to Carolyn Weber's. What was it? It was a book about Marie Antoinette, but that's France. This is not England or an English colony. But in general, I don't think women are necessarily wearing trousers. If you're used to wearing dresses, you figure out how to work around it.
We'll do one final question here,
Okay.
and this one is from Elizabeth, who asks, for interpreters who portray poorer citizens, do you distress the fabric before making the costumes?
No, we do not. We've been doing costumes for over 80 years, so these are clothes. So people wear them day in and day out, and we don't distress them. They just get distressed, and when someone has a position where they need to look a little bit more distressed, we'll pull something out that's had some hard wear in the past. So we don't really have to go out and artificially distress things. So when you see something that looks worn, chances are really good that that's something that somebody really actually wore out themselves.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. I do want to say thank you to Lori for joining us and giving us all this wonderful information. I also want to thank all of you watching out there at home and all of you who provided us with many, many, many wonderful questions. And of course, I do want to thank our wonderful donors who make programs like this and many more possible. Thank you very, very much for your support. It's only because of you that we can share the complete and engaging story of our nation's founding. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.